Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Manulife Business Success Series webinar on the COVID questions, mandatory vaccinations, rapid testing, screening, record retention, and the law. My name is Ian McLean, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we do live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, as we seek a renewed relationship based on the foundation of mutual understanding and respect. As participants in today's virtual event, we are coming together as one. We believe that everyone is free to be their true self and receive the same respect and opportunity, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, culture, identity, sexual orientation, beliefs, or language. We hope you will join us in fostering a positive environment here today that is a safe and welcoming space for all. We know there is more that we can do, and we are committed to listening, learning, and growing as we go. Today's session would not be possible without the continued support of our partners and our sponsors. So a special thank you to our title sponsor of the Business Success Series, Manulife. Our platinum sponsor for the series is the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and this month's presenting sponsor, our friends at Gore Mutual Insurance. These organizations and many others are committed to supporting our local economy and providing businesses with the resources and tools they need to thrive. Just before the session starts, I'd like to go over a few quick reminders. Please do ensure that your microphone is muted throughout the presentation so we can reduce any background noise. If you have questions that come up throughout the session, you can type them into the question box in your control panel at any time. If it's tech related, a representative of our team will get back to you right away. And if it's a question for today's presenter, I'll gather those up through the session and do our best to make sure a speaker has an opportunity to answer your questions. All attendees will be sent a recording of today's presentation, and it will also be made available on the Greater KW Chamber website. I'd like to now invite our good friend of the Chamber, Trevor McPherson. He is, of course, the Vice President of Member Services at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, to say a few words. Trevor.
Thanks, Ian. Really delighted to be here and excited to hear what Tushar has to say about the many questions you've submitted. Certainly unprecedented times and so many challenges. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the challenge that you are all going through right now. I know it's reached a point at which it's just feeling and really is like hanging on. And we're very, very attuned to that. We are in conversation with government on a regular basis, whether it be on the Small Business Grant Support Program, which we have a roundtable coming up with Minister Sarkaria to hear member concerns about what's not working with that. Also, given the extended lockdown, pushing for additional support. If you're not going to be able to operate, we really need that support for our SMEs if you have a chance of making it through. So want to also recognize this Chamber of Commerce as well as your partner chambers in Cambridge, Greg DeRocher and team, with what you've done with the rapid testing initiative, the rapid screening initiative, which we are scaling up across the province now, and we wouldn't be doing that if this chamber together with Cambridge had not done so. And I want to also note that the Chamber Check program that you have was recognized at our recent AGM with the Power of the Pivot Award. So really just want to speak to the fact that you are engaged with and members of one of our top chambers of commerce, and we have just over 140 chambers of commerce in the province, all pulling together and doing all that we can to support our member businesses. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Ian. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Trevor, and we appreciate the support. Both Greg and I, we wouldn't have been able to do the pilot program on rapid screening and our medical grade mask if it wasn't for the support of Rocco and yourself and the team at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and Perrin Beatty and his colleagues at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We always say we are stronger together, and it's so true, especially in this last period of time. The power of the Chamber network has never been more important. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to now invite Katerina Chrysostomou, Director of Marketing with Gore Mutual Insurance, to introduce today's speaker. Katerina.
Thank you, Ian. Gore Mutual Insurance is proud to be this month's presenting sponsor of the Business Success Series. I have the privilege of introducing today's speaker, Tushar Anandasagar. Tushar is an associate in Gowling WLG's Employment, Labor and Equalities Group. His practice focuses exclusively on the management side of employment, labor, human rights, and privacy law. Serving clients across all industries, Tushar advises on a broad range of contentious human resources matters, including with respect to onboarding, growth management, policy review, statutory compliance, employment litigation, labor arbitration, workers' compensation, occupational health and safety, privacy, data security, restructuring, and retrenchment. Tushar believes strongly in integrating with management teams, providing them with a comprehensive operation-focused perspective that balances relevant legal, social, and economic factors affecting the modern workplace. Thank you to all for joining us today. I will now pass you back to Ian.
Well, thank you, Katerina, and we appreciate the ongoing support of Gore and the work that you're doing with our staff to be able to pull these programs, this program together each Wednesday. And thank you so much for Andy and yourself and the senior team at Gore for supporting the work that we're doing at the Chamber. So much appreciated. Listen, let's dive right in. We got a lot of questions, and I think Tushar, we'll get started. We're going to start with the area of vaccinations, because it's obviously very topical. Now we're right into the vaccination program, but we also want to cover off as we discussed today, rapid screening, public health closure orders, layoff provisions. I know that's important, and then just some general practical issues going forward. So and feel free, for those listening in, I know we've got a good crowd today, use the chat box if you have questions, and I'll be sure to try and weave discussion. Okay, so let's start it. Tushar, I guess the one thing that is many people are interested in is, can an employer mandate vaccination as part of their workplace policy? And so that's a good place to start.
Thank you so much, Ian. Right out of the gate, that's the tough question, right? That's the million-dollar question, as we like to say. I think it's an open question at this time, and the reason I say that is we have some precedents from other sectors, and regulatory and legislative precedents from childcare, from schools, daycare settings, which allow, notionally at least, for the concept of mandatory vaccination to exist. But those sectors and those precedents don't necessarily apply to COVID-19. So we're looking at this through the lens of a little bit of a regulatory or a legislative vacuum at this time. So I think looking at this from a first principle standpoint, and maybe we can chat, through hypotheticals about an example. If you're looking at a pilot or a member of an airline crew that is required to fly to a country that requires mandatory vaccination, can the pilot or the airline crew get on the plane and travel to that destination? Are they supposed to stay on the plane if they're not vaccinated for the duration of that stint? So these contextual situations will come up. And I think as we move forward over the course of the next couple of months and years, context will really dictate whether or not an employer can or cannot implement a mandatory vaccination policy. And that's the reason why I say this is an open question. It's going to be situational based on our current frameworks and our current laws. And linking back to the precedents that I discussed, because I think that's a valuable sort of touching off point here. We are jumping off from the position of we do have an established framework for schools, for daycare centers, where you're required in many circumstances to prove before an individual is able to send a child to a school, a public school, that they have received any of a number. I think the list is currently something like 11 or 12 vaccinations. Proof of vaccination has to be provided and maintained. In the context of an outbreak, a student can be removed from the school if there's an outbreak to safeguard the health and safety and well-being of those around and the families that are involved. So again, linking back to the original comment, it's an open question at this time, but there are precedents, and we are trying to shine light on situations and circumstances where it might be allowable.
No, and I spent some part of my working career at the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. So the balancing act between individual rights, then there's all kinds of other things provincially, like labor law, Occupational Health and Safety Act, that we need to stay, that we have to be, as employers, we have a responsibility to all of our workforce. And then obviously the responsibility to, especially if you're front facing and you've got other people, so the public coming in. So I guess, you know, are there circumstances where an employer pushes ahead and says, look, if you're going to come into our workplace, you must be vaccinated? So there still may be some unsettled legal questions, but is there an ability to accommodate if someone says they will not get vaccinated, that you can say that's fine, but you can't come into the workplace for all those, because of those other responsibilities an employer has to have?
As an unbiased management side labor and employment lawyer, I would say yes, those circumstances do exist. And we can thank Quebec not only for poutine and some other great Montreal Canadiens plays, but also for taking the lead with respect to this issue. I mean, we currently have this type of a framework in place in Quebec, and they are leading the way for the other provinces right now. In certain sectors that are specifically the highest risk sectors. We're talking about healthcare, long-term care. There are pockets of Quebec employees and employers where vaccination can be mandated and actually has been mandated. And sort of looking at the framework that they have implemented is guiding for us, I think. So we look at this framework where vaccination or testing or some other form of verification has to be in place. I would say, you know, there's going to have to be a point in time when an employer decides, a first mover, let's call it, in Ontario, that this is something that, you know, is a priority for us, and we don't know how severe the next stages of the pandemic will be. And so as we move forward, we can look to those frameworks and those guidance points for an indication of how things might progress. So we talk about vaccination, or alternatively as a form of accommodation, rapid antigen testing, you know, 3 times a week, or rapid antigen testing before a person gets to enter the workplace. We could theoretically establish these forms of accommodations with a menu of options, so to speak, that an accommodation seeker can be provided with.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good point. And one of the reasons that what Trevor was talking about, the rapid screening kits, the Abbott screening kits that we're making available to all businesses in Waterloo region, and as he pointed out, it's now across the province in over 80 places. So if we don't want to make a mandate, a vaccination mandate in your workplace, leaving aside whether it's legal or not, but a business could say that's what I'm choosing to do. But if they don't want to do that and say it's going to be up to the individual, and that's part of the reason the provincial framework that they put out says we can't fully reopen until we hit certain yard markers, 70% with 1 dose, and later on 75% with 1 dose and 25 with 2. So it all does come down to fully reopening your business, and the provincial economy is directly tied to vaccinations. But if an employer doesn't want to take that step, say you want to come into my workplace, our workplace, you have to be vaccinated. What are some of those other options? And I think you touched on this. Would it be the accommodation is vaccination, but I do want you to do a rapid screening each day or several times a week?
Absolutely. There are a number of other, and sorry if I just may jump in here, Ian, I think somebody may have their mic unmuted. We're hearing a little bit of feedback. If everybody could please make sure that it is muted. Thank you so much. One thing that I think is worthwhile is not only looking at the step 1, step 2, step 3 approach that the province announced last Thursday, this new framework, which is very, very much linked to the vaccination rates, right? The 60, 75 thresholds. Those are hypotheticals that are in place at this time. They're linked to key public health unit indicators such as ICU capacity and whatnot. We also need to look at what the province recently did just a couple of weeks ago with the introduction of these 3 paid days of sick leave. They've effectively blessed an approach that incentivizes vaccination. You're providing paid sick time under a provincial framework for individuals to take time off from work, leave the workplace, go off, get vaccinated. if and when they should have some form of a reaction or you know, a minor response, then they get accommodated with paid time off for a couple of days. That's a significant step. And so in January, February, we were looking at the concept of a vaccination incentive policy and what can an employer incentivize and whether or not it's safe. I think on the heels of this recent announcement by the province, we're in a safe space here. I think employers can definitively look at ways to encourage, number one, and incentivize, number two, vaccination at the workplace. Incentives could be something as simple as a gift card or paid time off or lieu time, you know, on the heels of the pandemic, whenever whenever that happens. They could also take the form of you know, additional compensation or you know, some manner of incentivizing or encouraging vaccination. We would recommend against, you know, overt mechanisms such as providing people with hats that say, you know, yay, I've been vaccinated. Those can be construed a little bit negatively in circumstances where someone can't be vaccinated. But again, we're in a safe space here, and the province has effectively condoned this type of an approach, and they've effectively taken that first step. So, you know, I do think that there is a significant ground beneath mandating and between sort of taking no position at all that an employer can step in and occupy here. Oh, sorry, Ian, I have no audio on your, from your side.
I've muted myself. Now there's a question that's come in, and I think there's lots of folks who have questions around the vaccines themselves. That's not for you and I, whereas we're not experts, but it's obviously been globally, the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and others have been approved and are being used certainly in Canada. So there's still maybe questions around that, but how do we, if an employer or employee says I'm not getting the vaccine and refuses to come to work because they haven't been vaccinated, because this is where it gets into, if it's no mandate from the employer, but say I'm not getting vaccinated, but then I'm also not coming to work because they may not trust the vaccine or they have some concerns about it. Is that where you start to get into how do you accommodate? Because each circumstance is going to be different. I mean, you try and have a set of rules, but you're going to have to deal with the exceptions, because there are, you know, there is certainly a this has all evolved in terms of vaccinations fairly quickly. I think that the overwhelming evidence is that it's safe, but there's still concerns. How do you accommodate that person who may not be comfortable with the vaccines, but also then isn't comfortable coming back into the workplace if and when I should say that starts to happen again?
You know what, and Ian, that's a fantastic question. I mean, we look to those parallel situations that we first talked about. We look to the accommodation mechanisms and the rules, protocols, procedures that are currently in place in our schools, in our daycare workplaces that Quebec has in place for its healthcare and long-term care sector employees. These frameworks are already existing in real time and have been in place for some time. So we look at the accommodation analysis through the narrow lens of the law, let's say, because there's a whole slew of practical issues that we can get into. But through the narrow lens of the law, we look at whether or not the accommodation is substantiated. Just because somebody says they don't agree with the concept of vaccination doesn't necessarily mean that a refusal is substantiated. If we're looking at the Quebec policy, for instance, there needs to be some tie back to what's called an enumerated or a protected ground under human rights legislation. And you would have heard of this before, but religious exemptions could be one, but probably the more significant one would be medical exemptions, such as if an individual is allergic to one of the ingredients within a vaccine. On those points, however, I will say, and this is tying back to the sort of novelty of this whole situation, that we have promising announcements in the space of vaccination. There are a number of different vaccines. We started with 2. There are a number of different strategies for administering vaccination, including ones that are being developed for parts of the world where they don't have a refrigerated supply chain to deliver vaccinations to remote places in the Sahara Desert. The vaccinations are being administered in pill form. These are being developed in real time as we speak. And so even for folks that are afraid of needles, there are some significant changes that are happening all around us. And I think once we get to a place where, you know, it could be 5, 6, 7, 8 plus months from here, where we can talk about a return to office or return to work, or en masse going back to a new normal, we are going to be looking necessarily at a different vaccination picture, including different vaccination strategies. And so I think, keep an eye on the future, but at the same time, really, I think the focus should be on establishing policies and frameworks to deal with these accommodations now.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that has come up, and I think you've got your existing workforce, and you have a set of responsibilities since you've already hired them under a certain set of understanding, right? That you've hired for new hires, because then you get into having two classes of employees. But as you start hiring and saying moving forward, because I think the one thing that is true, the virus is not going away. Like, we're living with it, and so and whether you're vaccinated or using screening or wearing masks, take your pick, you got to do something to manage the virus, because it's like SARS. People, need to understand SARS is still out there from when my daughter was born 18 years ago. SARS, it still exists in that form, but we know how to manage it now. So, but if you get to looking and saying you're not going to mandate, but how do you verify that people have a vaccination status? And can you do something different when you're hiring, of saying part of the offer of employment is that you have a vaccination in place? Because then it's before the contract or the employment arrangement is finalized. So maybe touch on both of those parts, right? Like, as you're doing hiring moving forward, this will be something that a lot of employers start to say, okay, we want to be conscious of that moving forward. But if you don't have a mandate, how do you or can you have an understanding of what your existing workforce's vaccination status is?
Absolutely. Great questions. I mean, if we look at the context of a specific situation and the regulations that are in place at a given time, I think that'll help to dictate what is a reasonable ask at the pre-employment phase for an employer that is just pushing the boat out and saying, we want to hire for a specific position. If we look to Quebec for a lead on this, because they've already implemented a version of a mandatory vaccination policy, they have effectively permitted this in certain spaces in those high-risk sectors where the pandemic has been most severe. And I think that contextual approach that applies to the long-term care sector, that applies to the healthcare sector, it may be a little bit difficult to spin up and sell in different non-congregate settings where the risk factors are a little bit lower. And so I think for employers that are looking at what's reasonable, what is a reasonable ask for the specific provision in question, the specific position in question, they really should be looking to the guidance that's coming out of the regulators that the provincial governments, that the federal governments have established for their workplaces. Looking to that Quebec example, if I were an employer in that particular space on the heels of this announcement, I would feel comfortable putting that question in. But on the Ontario side, where we have effectively silence on this from the provincial government to date, we haven't got that same warm and fuzzy feeling with respect to whether or not this is permissible, and doing so might invite exposure. Again, looking into the theoretical, whether or not we can mandate and whether or not an accommodation framework can be put in place will help to define the boundaries of this. But, going back to the initial discussion point, Ian, this is still open. And we're into the theoretical here, and whether or not we'll be able to establish this at this time is unclear. It's a moving target. We may very well have a response coming soon.
So moving on, there's a couple of things I want to kind of a few strands to pull together. So I know I've been contacted, the Ontario Chamber, Cambridge Chamber have had many employers who are prepared to offer a vaccination clinic and say, I'm prepared to put the time and expense to have a socially distanced space, be able to provide a vaccination location, yes, for their own employees and their families, but would open them up to the broader community, because at least what the public policy decision is the faster that we have more people vaccinated, the quicker we can get out the other side. So you can dispute whether they're safe or not, but that's the position of every level of government in the province or in the country right now. But you also have that offering of those vaccination clinics. And then there's this whole question of how do you incentivize, and some people, I guess you could look at it and saying you're coercing people, but in having it in your workplace, and maybe having incentives, and those have to be voluntary, but really ultimately, where do you come down on saying giving people the easiest, quickest opportunity to get vaccinated, with the incentive of doing it conveniently in your workplace, or having incentives? And I see a comment from one of our construction-related companies. It says that they're giving a bonus to every employee of $150 that does get vaccinated, because they just think that's better if their employees are all vaccinated, that they think their workplace will be safer and they're less likely to be shut down. And that's really the fear here, I think, for most businesses, is if we don't get that full vaccination, is my business at risk? So maybe tie together that issue of, and ultimately having vaccinations in the workplace is up to the public policy. It's public health. Do they need the help? In some places they may have more need than necessarily here, but there's lots of offers, because many businesses want to have that incentive of making it easier for their employees and their families to get vaccinated.
I think we're in a safe space here as long as we're looking at this through the lens, as you mentioned, of an opt-in approach or a voluntary approach. When we get into mandating, I think that is where the laws really are a little bit lagging at this time, Ian. I mean, I think, if we look at the construction example, we don't have a decree from our regulators, from Public Health Ontario, saying, this is something that is reasonable in this sector, having regard to the risk factors. Not even first responders have that sort of framework in place within this province at this time. So if we look at this as an opt-in model, I do think we're in a safe space as long as the employer is accounting for the operational risks that might come up. So those might be human resources, those might be insurance issues that come up with respect to having, at least under the current model, we're looking at employees and members of the local community coming into the clinic. We're talking about possible civil liability as a result of some form of adverse reaction. And so I do think that there are risks to be accounted for even with respect to the opt-in model. You have to have a qualified doctor or nurse practitioner administering the vaccine, for instance, right? We're not in a place yet where we can do the supervised self-vaccination until we get it in pill form, and so at some point, hopefully. But so currently we're looking at this under the framework of a public health sponsored on-site clinic. And we are seeing this in a couple of different workplaces. We've got, Toyota comes to mind, for instance, in our region, and with reasonably good results, as long as we're following the opt-in model and safeguards are put in place to keep employee records safe and minimize dissemination of those records.
So let's move on. That's a good segue to one of the concerns, and I think everyone, business and individuals, take it very seriously, is the privacy of our personal information, and particularly our health information, whether it's mental health, physical health, vaccinations, take your pick. There's a lot of concern around how we safeguard individual information. So speak a little bit about the privacy issues, the record retention. I know I got my vaccination at one of the pharmacies with AstraZeneca. Go AZ! I want my second shot as soon as I can, but no one's entitled to know that information, and I take that right now as my employer, which is the Chamber of Commerce, has no right to know what I got and when I got it. So we're still into this whole question of, can you mandate? What are you entitled to know? And then that privacy issue and the record retention. Maybe touch on that, because that's an important and complex question.
And I would add to that as well, Ian, that it's rapidly evolving too, because the protocols and frameworks for record retention, even think about the questionnaires that you have to fill out when you go and sit down at a restaurant. A year ago, it was just read the sign, and now they have to take down your contact information and make sure they can contact trace you. And so that's a moving target as well. I do think that the protocols need to be constantly looked at to make sure that you're adhering to the relevant timeframes. We also have to think about, what does an employer actually need to administer the employment relationship. And so if we look at the AstraZeneca or Moderna or Pfizer, do you need to know which brand it was? No. Do you need to know which arm it was administered in? No. Do you need to know whether you got it at Shoppers Drug Mart or Rexall or Sobeys or any? No. At the end of the day, even if you're administering a vaccination incentive policy and you just want to check off against who got the incentive, going with the construction company example, who got the incentive and who didn't, flash the piece of paper. There may be no need to retain it at all at this point in time. Conversely, look at the Quebec example, right? We've got different ends of the spectrum. If we are looking at a framework for high-risk workplaces where this is mandated and you have a statutory compliance obligation, the laws are going to change, but we're going to get advance notice of that. We're going to get notice saying, hey, this is mandatory. You need to have vaccination records on hand so that we can maintain a certain ratio, for instance, of people that are able to come in, or introduce certain individuals into high-risk settings, for instance, during an outbreak. If that is part of the framework which has yet to be established, we'll have some notice of that in future. At this point in time, I like the principles of minimal invasion and only taking what it is exactly that you need and not keeping more than what you actually need at this time.
Well, we're actually seeing this and Trevor talked about our rapid screening program. We'll come to that in a minute, but in terms of what we're being asked to collect and what we want to have access to and what we don't want to have access to, because we don't want the responsibility. We want to be the distributor, not the keeper of information. But we'll come to that in a minute. Listen, and here's a tricky one. I mean, we were talking about incentives, talking about wanting to know what percentage, because you're very right. I mean, you can accommodate some of your workforce by saying, okay, we still maintain herd immunity by saying if people aren't vaccinated, if you're mixing them together in the right with the rest of the vast majority that will be vaccinated, you can kind of mitigate your own occupational health and safety obligations, your labor act or labor legislation. But I guess it comes down to building on the records or the privacy issues. What if you're told, have you been vaccinated? Yes, I've been vaccinated, when in fact Ian hasn't been vaccinated. How does that be, like, what kind of issue does that present if you have basically an untruthful interaction with your employee? Like, does that become an issue? Does that become something that's a potential fireable offense? I mean, those sorts of things are I'm inevitably going to come up. Hope not very often, but it's going to be one of those issues that does come up.
Absolutely. And you know what, with any sort of dishonesty in the context of an employment relationship, there could be disciplinary or other consequences on a sliding scale under the principles of progressive discipline. Look at the pilot example. It could cause a significant regulatory issue, could cause a lawsuit for every person that's sitting in that pressurized metal box up in the sky. For individuals who are in that long-term care setting in Quebec, if there's falsification of information, there may very well be disciplinary consequences that follow if an individual misstates the truth. And so, absolutely, at this time, I would say, yes, there are theoretical disciplinary consequences until we're at a point when we can mandate and require it and say that this is a protocol that needs to be adhered to. That, from the mandating side, I think is theoretical in Ontario. But even under an incentive policy, if somebody misstates the truth in order to benefit from a monetary incentive, that's fundamental dishonesty, and I call that a disciplinary offense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the things we're hearing about, and I think we know is in I guess whether you agree with it or not, it's going to happen. And that's vaccination passports, because even if it doesn't happen in the province of Ontario, as an example, you can be flat guaranteed that there are other countries that will say you cannot come into my country from your country unless you demonstrate you've had a vaccine. And so it's happening. I think there are policymakers at all levels, provincially and federally, here in Canada, are grappling with the fact that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how. So, let's talk. I mean, maybe just what is your view on the vaccination passport, and how it may. I mean, I guess there's extremes. If it's, well, we're not going to do anything in Ontario or Canada. But if you want to leave the country, there's going to have to be some mechanism, because otherwise you're not going to be able to go to Europe or Asia or other places that will have these mandates. maybe talk about where you think that it is, and that's another one. I know usually lawyers give qualified things, but in this case, just about everything is a movable target right now. Like there's no settled law or very little settled law on any of these topics. But where is it right now, and where do you think it's going in terms of vaccination passports?
Fantastic. I'm happy to go down the rabbit hole. So, I mean, we've got some first movers in the private sector that I think are really pushing the bar with respect to this up. IATA is one of them that we've seen in the news. They've established a digital vaccination passport. And so I think we're going to see private sector movement first, and the law is going to lag a little bit behind until such time as we have those, countries, plural, that impose this requirement. We already have a similar requirement with respect to entry and exiting from Canada. We have 72 hours pre and post COVID-19 testing. I'm going to put my hand up and say that my father is currently self-isolating at a hotel in Cambridge. He's serving his 14 days of self-isolation because we don't have a suitable venue here in my apartment. And so, we're dealing with a variety of these types of issues now. And so will they be legal? I think that practicality will dictate what is and isn't legal at the end of the day. And if we look to the private sector for guidance, we're already seeing that happen in real time now. I think it's coming, and we need to get ahead of it.
Yeah, and I think that maybe that's it more than anything. The practical reality of whether we like the legal consequence here is that there's going to be around the world, in one way, shape, or form, Canada and Ontario will have to deal with the reality that other places are doing it, and we'll have to, for our own, as a global citizens and as a part of a global supply chain, we're going to be dealing with other jurisdictions that, in fact, have a passport. So, but certainly something for an employer, and maybe this is the last part on this one, is they should be paying attention to this, because once things start to open up, you say, okay, well, we want to go to that trade conference, or you've got sales staff going to other jurisdictions. You better understand what the obligations are for your employee to be able to gain access to those other jurisdictions, because it's not going to be, it won't be easy, it won't be seamless, and there won't be one answer. It's going to be a it depends answer of where you're going and what the obligations are.
100%, and we're already seeing this play out in the U.S., where the EEOC, where regulators, where the president has gone on the television and said that a private sector employer, a workplace, can establish mandatory vaccination protocols. And so a US-based company with employees in Canada who have to, on occasion, go down to the US for training or sales or whatever you name it, they will likely have to grapple with these issues before anyone else, and they may have to deal with those individual cases and circumstances on a case by case. And I do think that, again, we're looking at practicality here, right? If an individual cannot enter a facility that they were hired to enter at the point of hire before COVID-19, what does that do to the employment relationship? There could be very significant implications here in Canada.
Yeah. So let's move on to rapid screening, because we talked about vaccinations. That's a really important, because I think if there is such a thing as a silver bullet to getting to the other side and having more of a fully reopened, both social and economic, like being able to go and have your dad come from the airport and come right to your apartment, or getting together with your family, or fully reopen your business, vaccinations is really the key. But in between, part of the reason that we started our rapid antigen screening program pilot, and we received a donation of $1.5 million medical grade ASTM level 300 masks from Eclipse Automation, and we've been giving those out with the rapid screening kits, because those are two of the tools between now and full vaccination, which is September, October, certainly into the fall. Those are two tools that we believe are the types of things that businesses need now to utilize, so they can open or reopen and stay open safely before full herd immunity through vaccinations and that whole process takes place. That's my opinion, but I think it's an informed one. But when we started this program, we were obviously conscious of the fact that these programs kits are easy. They're easy to do. So the province made the change that it can be self-administered. So I often say a well-trained basset hound could do these screening kits because they're so simple, even I can do it, which makes them basically idiot-proof. But they're simple to do. But we've made perfectly clear you can't obligate an employee to do this screening themselves. Like you make it available. So maybe talk about that in terms of, because we're back into privacy and legal and what you can force someone to do in terms of forcing them or obligating them to do it. On the other hand, you can also be conscious of who you're allowing into your workplace. And under what conditions. So maybe talk about the rapid screening and the importance of that, but also what the rules of the road would be.
Well, you know what, Ian, I fall, again, a totally unbiased management side lawyer here. I fall more in line with, what is safe? What is the strategy that's going to provide maximum safety to the individuals that are walking into the physical workplace? We look at temperature testing, for instance. A year and a half ago, if you walked up to me with a temperature testing gun and held it up to my forehead, I'd say, get out of here. Like, there's no way. Now look how much has changed, right? And so, concepts of the medical grade masking. We now have the development and the rollout of ECAN 95 made in Canada solutions, right? We are looking at new strategies to deal with an evolving issue. And if there are tools available in the tool shed, and the vaccine is the lawnmower, but you've also got a significant number of weeds growing in the lawn, why wouldn't you have access to the weed whacker and the other tools? That's the way that I look at rapid antigen screening, and I try to stay away from characterizing it as testing, but I talk about it in terms of rapid antigen screening, because the PCR test is reportable and all this other stuff to the local health authorities. There are some self-isolation triggers and other aspects that are different from these PanBio or BD Veritor tests, right? So screening, what are we talking about? Well, I look to the law for guidance here, and we've got a really promising first step from a unionized employer by the name of Crescent Care. It's a retirement care facility in the local community. And this particular employer pushed the boat out and said, we're going to mandate PCR testing. So those are the full brain tickling, remove your brain through your sinuses test. So we've got this Crescent Care policy that says, we're putting this on a schedule for the greater good, for the health and safety, well-being of our employees and others at our workplace, including the residents that we serve. And there were grievers, there were individuals who took issue with the strategy. There were individuals that they effectively took, they had concerns with respect to the pain it was causing them, or deviated septum, or individual accommodation questions that came up. And they hit the policy with a hammer and said, this is completely unreasonable, and the union challenged the policy. What happened as a result of that case was that the arbitrator actually came down on the side, but this is PCR testing. The arbitrator came down on the side that this policy in this context, dealing with these risks, was entirely reasonable. And if we look at PCR testing in terms of invasion on this side of the spectrum, and rapid antigen testing, as you described, the basset hound or brushing your teeth, or I'm not going to talk about pregnancy tests, yeah. But we look at the ease of use of the rapid antigen screening. Again, screening. I think that this is no different conceptually from requiring individuals to fill out a questionnaire, from making them wear steel-toed boots, from making them wear safety goggles, from a workplace health and safety standpoint. And it's a tool that's available now, and we look to this in initial case, at least, for support for the principle that we can mandate this for individuals that are walking into the workplace for any reason. So employees, visitors, volunteers, contractors.
And I think one of the things we've discovered in the 6 weeks we've been running the program is, and some of them are unionized environments, and there was some, initial, you can't force us to do this, but ultimately people vote with their, I kind of like Tuesdays and Thursdays because it's screening day, because when I go home at the end of the day, I can say to my family and my parents and my kids, I tested negative today, right? So there's almost a mental health an acknowledgement that the uncertainty around COVID, just on a personal level, is something that concerns people. And I think from an employer's perspective of saying, I'm doing everything I can to keep my employees safe, but to keep my business open, right? That's it's sort of a dual purpose. Listen, if an employer can mandate rapid screening, or antigen screening, and again, it is screening. This is what you're doing is, if this is for, and I could preface this, you would know this, but just for our listeners, over 50%, probably 55% of all transmissions of COVID is happening from you and me, as an example, who have no symptoms, don't feel ill at all, but it's coming from asymptomatic carriers, right? So you would never know you're sick. So this rapid antigen screening is not a diagnostic, but it gives you a sense of whether the virus is starting to accumulate, and it's very simple to do. The efficacy of it, they call it serial rapid antigen screening, which is when you do it on a regular basis, you're going to catch it with a 94-95% effectiveness rate. So there's all kinds of reasons that this can be one of the things that is not very invasive, very simple to do, takes about 8 or 10 minutes. So I think it works from an individual perspective as a worker, but it also works for an employer. But if you do mandate it, and in certain circumstances you're saying you could do the mandate, it may get tested, but you could say you're either not coming in or you have to do this test. What would be some of those legal implications? I mean, is that where you get into someone could take the challenge, go to Superior Court, or go through a legal process? What would be some of those legal implications to consider?
You know what, Ian, the legal implications, I think it really depends on the particular personalities of the individuals you're dealing with. We have a free and open court system, so there's always room for some mudslinging. I like to think of it that way. But leaving that aside, we do have sort of notional risk. Unlike the PCR test, it's not as significant notional risk of possible exposure. So insurance is a good first step. Making sure that you're covered off under an insurance policy, that you advise your insurer that this is happening. In terms of employment-specific rules and regulations, if you've got individuals that are waiting outside for 15 minutes while the test is happening, talk about overtime, talk about lieu time, talk about compensation for that time. They are there at your behest as the employer, and therefore it's compensable time. It's not sort of rolled into the new commuting time. We can take steps to ensure that we're covering off against privacy, data security, obtaining consents before we're submitting individuals to a diagnostic screening, and obtaining releases in the forms that are acceptable in law for the province of Ontario. We can deal with these issues of confidentiality, what happens with the information, and any possible record retention, reporting obligations, and issues of that sort. These are more than likely dealt with, I think, ideally in the form of a consent that an individual would sign, and it won't be a heavy document. It could be something as simple as a one-pager that many individuals would sign off before strapping on their snowboards or going to a yoga class or getting your chiropractic adjustment. And so, not too dissimilar from that type of an approach, but really just to cover the bases. But I think the primary step, the good backstop there is insurance. Just to make sure that any possible exposure point is dealt with right off the hop.
Okay, let's move on to public health closure orders, and I know that's been more of an issue in Peel and Toronto and Hamilton, or York, Peel and Toronto, a little bit in Hamilton, where there have been outbreaks, and they've had some of these, and you can describe what Section 22 is briefly, but it's not my sense, but do you anticipate KW would move in that same direction, or does it really depend on case counts? But let's talk about what a Section 22 order is, and what are the circumstances that they happen, and then move on. Do you think that that's a possibility here in Waterloo Region?
I think it really depends, as you said, Ian, on case counts, on the specific factors that affect our local area. We might not see, just looking at last summer as evidence of how things declined, the case counts declined as things warmed up. We may not see something like this until the fall. What's interesting about what's happening in Peel, Hamilton, and in Toronto is that there's really not that much that has changed with respect to Section 22 orders. There's this provision under the Health Protection and Promotion Act called Section 22, which allows a chief medical officer of a local health unit to effectively come in and shut a workplace, school, you name it, down in the interest of preventing an outbreak. And so that pre-existed the COVID-19 pandemic. pandemic. It was in place for SARS and MERS. It was in place before that. And so we've definitely seen those types of approaches implemented as of March 2020 going forward. These class orders are just codifying a more recent sort of putting employers on notice that, 2+ cases, you have to report them. 5+ cases, we can shut you down. I just want to kind of refine the overall sort of thinking about this, though, because there are circumstances where an employer across a large facility, for instance, might have significantly more than 5 cases. Their interest is not so much in shutting an employer or a workplace down. The interest is in minimizing workplace transmission. And as long as an employer is proactively dealing with workplace transmission points, plexiglass barriers, hand sanitizer, engineering controls, ventilation, as long as you're proactively dealing with these points, you're significantly reducing the likelihood of a shutdown order. And the key sort of point to keep in mind is, even if you look at the text of these recent class orders for Toronto, Peel, Hamilton, the text of those orders retains a significant amount of discretion for the chief medical officer of that health unit to actually say, no, we're not going to shut you down. You're doing everything you can. You've ordered the shift and cohorts to self-isolate, and we're just going to wait and see what happens, and we'll take this day by day kind of thing. So there's a significant amount of discretion that can be exercised between full shutdown, partial shutdown, or no shutdown at all.
So, and I guess this is the practical part of this. It will be dependent on circumstances, but as a general principle, if an employer is subject to a shutdown order for some reason by the public health unit, is there any appeal process? Because it's in most cases there would be, but I don't know who you appeal to if this is coming from the medical officer of health in your region. Who would you appeal to, or is that just not something that's allowable?
I would say technically under law it's allowable, Ian, but the time frames, they've designed the class orders very carefully. So the time frames for an appeal are, generally speaking, something in the range of 15 days. For the HSARB, it's the Appeals Resolution Board, but the class orders shut you down for 10 days. And so by the time you gear up for an appeal, you're already 5 days past. And so it's not practical, I would say, legally speaking. The best way to avoid a shutdown order is to avoid a shutdown order and to take steps to minimize the risk of transmission. So your COVID safety plan and all of the engineering, administrative controls, staggering your shift times, rapid antigen screening, encouraging your employees to go get tested if they have symptoms. Yeah.
Better masks, yeah.
And medical grade masks. I cannot say enough about the medical grade masks. The EKN95s, they're cheap, they're effective, and again, it's one of those key. Having dealt with a couple of these shutdowns myself and assisted clients with them, they look to the types of PPE that you're deploying in response to increasing risk of variants and other risk factors in enclosed congregate settings such as offices and manufacturing facilities. So the medical grade PPE is going to be a significant risk factor that will help.
And it just, I know we're getting tight on time, but I want to reiterate that. I mean, again, through chambercheck.ca, free medical grade masks are available, as well as free Abbott screening kits. And the medical grade masks are a two-ply cloth masks that you and I might have started with a year ago. Might be somewhere between 8 and 20% efficient at containing. The medical grade, just the ones that loop over your ears, if you're wearing it properly over your nose, are north of 92%. So you don't even have to get the KN95 or the N95. A medical grade mask will go a long way to containing any spread in your workplace. So between the rapid screening and the mask, that's my sermon, and it's also our little plug for the program. Listen, just before we sign off, because this is starting to come up, and there's a timing issue around this, and I'll start with this. But there's the layoff provisions that have been put in place and extended several times because the way the labor law was constructed and then was not prepared for a pandemic. So can an employer lay an employee off during COVID-19, and are there implications and risks under the law? And I think this really is, some may have been laid off, but you at some point it becomes a dismissal, and then there are other things that kick in. Maybe walk us through where that stands right now, because it has the potential, as this thing drags on and various industries are not reopening, that you're going to come up to some trigger dates. I know the government's aware of that. We're pushing this forward, but maybe talk from your perspective of what people should be thinking about.
Well, I think one of the most significant changes that warrants mentioning is the suspension of the ESA, the Employment Standards Act temporary layoff to termination trigger point. The key one is under what's called the deemed infectious disease emergency leave, or the IDLE, the IDEL. And so at present, if an employee is laid off for circumstances that are related to COVID-19, reduction of hours, reduction of wages, something along those lines, they would automatically convert, their layoff would automatically convert from a temporary layoff under the ESA into what's known as and what's called a deemed IDEL under regulation. Here's the big issue that's coming up, and sort of we're looking at this now and preparing for this, so to speak, because we're not sure about what the province is going to do in terms of an extension. The current deemed IDEL sort of automatic conversion of a temporary layoff into this job protected leave of absence drops off and currently expires as of July, the start of July, July 3rd. And so what happens at that stage? Under the current regulations, employees will basically go back from this deemed IDEL onto a temporary layoff. And under the ESA, there are two time frames to keep in mind for temporary layoffs. There are 13 weeks, right? 13 out of 20 weeks for purposes of employees that are not receiving any forms of substantial payments, compensation. The benefits continuation is not there. There are certain trigger points that have to be in place in order to extend beyond 13 out of 20 weeks. So that's I think many sort of rank and file employees who would be in the retail sector or in the sectors that are probably the hardest hit by the pandemic. The second category is the 35 out of 52 weeks time frame. And so that would be, many of your office staff and your white collar employees in industries that have been hit by the pandemic. But I would say the real concern at this stage is that when those individuals hit those thresholds, the 13 weeks or the 35 weeks, so to speak, their employment terminates under statute. It is deemed to terminate. And that is something that I think many many employers, they're simply not prepared for, and that's the reason why those extensions, the successive extensions of that deemed IDEL regulation have actually happened. So we're doing the same thing on Gowling's side. We are pushing for an extension at this point in time. We're communicating with all channels that we have available to us and doing what we can. And I know the chambers, plural, are pulling in the same direction because many employers are not going to be able to ramp up within 13 weeks from July 3rd of 2021.
And the whole purpose of this last 13, 14 months has been to keep employees connected to employers so that when things open up, there's jobs to go back to. So thank you for the work you're doing on that. And just quickly, we're almost out of time. I got two quick questions. So I'm going to ask them fast if you answer fast. Just kidding. If you do have to let someone go or lay someone off, what's the best way to reduce the risk to I mean, look, it's happening. Your business is struggling, and you may have to do that. What's the best way to manage the risk from the business perspective?
So if the employee is bound to an ESA, a valid ESA only employment contract, and the termination is happening without cause, I would say that the risk is relatively low and it's effectively been managed. The issue is that there have been a couple of recent cases that have changed the framework for analysis for the interpretation of employment contracts. One key takeaway that I'll leave with the attendees: if your employment contracts say just cause, we can terminate you for just cause. Call your local counsel. Call your happy to assist, but definitely consult with your counsel and ask them to update your employment contracts and the process for doing so. There is a process for existing employees for doing so, because those just cause contracts are now the latest hot button issue for the courts, and leaving those in place can invite common law exposure. And if you are dealing with common law exposure, I think that is something that businesses of all sizes, the courts aren't going to cut you slack because you're a mom and pop shop or you're a small employer. They look at employers, plural, in the same way. They treat IBM the same way that they treat Joe's Bakery. And so at the end of the day, consult with your lawyer, have them review the contract, talk about strategies to mitigate, because it's case by case, but there are mechanisms and protocols available.
Okay, just last question quickly. So practical issues going forward. I mean, again, chambercheck.ca, we have a program in there around how to safely, with Exonify, which is online training for safe reopening or operation of your business. the region, and we're working with the Regional Waterloo Cambridge Chamber ourselves on an ambassador program where we'll actually have trained people that can come in at your request as a business to say, are we operating safely? Do we have the safeguards in place? So there are some tools available. But what's your general advice for employers as they look towards a reopening or a return to office? Like, what are the things that what's the general advice that you would give them to reopen, but do it safely?
I would say first and foremost, COVID-19 workplace safety plan has to be in place. Many individuals and employers that have remained open throughout the course of the pandemic, they've already had this. For offices that have been closed since March 17 of 2020, and with workers that have been sort of working from home since then, they may not have even considered this. So that needs to be in place before individuals come back. And the other key takeaway is look at all available options for risk mitigation, including rapid antigen screening. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but look at rapid antigen screening as a strategy for reducing risk as you reopen, and work those policies out, figure out the consents to legal exposure points before you invite employees to come back to the workplace.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you to Shara for joining us today. That does bring us to the end of today's session. Thank you again to our title sponsor of the series, Manulife, our platinum sponsor of the series, the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and this month's presenting sponsor, Gore Mutual Insurance. Today, thank you, Tushar. We really appreciate you taking time. You're a great interview. I'd love to have you on the radio show because you're. We may yet do that. Well, we've appreciated your expertise and taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Thank you. Finally, thank you so much for having me, and thank you. Really appreciate it.
Okay, and finally, to all of you for joining us today. As a reminder, we do host a new Business Success Series session every Wednesday at 1 p.m. We are taking a short break and we'll be back on Wednesday, June the 9th for celebrating Indigenous and Pride Month, you and your business. Joining us as we hear from Danny Baisley of Driver Seat and Stephen Jackson of Anishinaabe Outreach on how to recognize, celebrate, and support our Indigenous and 2SL LGBTQ+ communities during Indigenous and Pride Month, as well as year-round. We hope to see you then. For details and to register, please go to greaterkwchamber.com. Please do share this program and this series with your friends and colleagues, and join us every Wednesday afternoon for another edition of the Business Success Series. Because if it's Wednesday, it's the Business Success Series. And I'll leave you with this: stay positive, test negative, and get vaccinated. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.